As you know, most Disney princesses from the animated classics live happily ever after, and those who got sequels to their movies, like Cinderella, do appear to be living happily. But did you ever notice that Ariel is the only one of the classic Disney princesses to have had a child that we meet in her sequel? In The Little Mermaid 2, Return to the Sea, we all got to meet Melody, the daughter of Ariel and Eric. Melody is shown to be a girl who is full of spirits and for some reason finds herself drawn to the sea, with her constantly having dreams and visions of herself as a mermaid. Much like her mother before her, Melody ended up making a deal with a wicked sea witch, who happened to be Ursula's sister. This deal would transform her into a mermaid, which would inevitably result in Ariel needing to save her. It was a fun idea for a movie, but was not received well by critics. The bigger question being asked about the sequel, and has been being asked for a while, is why is Ariel the only princess who has a child? This isn't to say that the other princesses didn't marry the person whom they loved and then went on to live a happy life. That's likely what happened to the majority of them. I mean, we know Aladdin and Jasmine ended up getting married in The King of Thieves, and Cinderella obviously ended up marrying Prince Charming, but why didn't any of them seem to have any children? I mean, back in their time periods, that's what royalty did shortly after getting married. They continued the bloodline. So why was Ariel the only one who was able to do so through Disney? Well, there are quite a few theories floating around the internet that discuss that very topic and could shed a lot of light on Ariel's story and why she was the only one to have a child. And I have to admit, some of them are pretty convincing and quite logical, I might add. Be sure to stick around so you can find out what Disney's signature phrase actually means in other languages. Alright, so the first idea is based on the fact that Disney likes to pull stories and tales from old folklore, and even mythology at times. And if you were to look into the mythology surrounding the mermaid, depictions of them can be found in ancient cultures all around the world, just under different names, of course. In Japan, they have the myth or legend of the Kappa, or in Brazil, they refer to mermaids as the Ipupiara. But what's really interesting is that back when these myths began being spread around, it was a time way before the internet. So for the most part, the tales likely remained in their region of origin. Hence, why some of each culture's myths would be slightly different. I mean, honestly, it's amazing to think about why all of these different cultures that had yet to interact all had the same style of monsters in their tales. And when you look at the concept surrounding the mermaid, it's just as interesting. In almost all lore for mermaids, they are depicted as these beings that are half fish and half human. But where does this concept come from? Well, for that, we're going to have to go back pretty far in time, all of the way back to ancient Mesopotamia. As a matter of fact, one Quora user pointed out that the first known myth of a mermaid might actually be why Ariel was the only Disney princess to have a child. You see, in Mesopotamian culture, there is a story of a mermaid who was known as Atargatis, a sea goddess who turned herself into a mermaid in order to mate with a land lover, as a pirate would say. Well, after the two of them got a little bit R-rated, Atargatis ended up getting pregnant and went back to sea, to where she would give birth to a daughter by the name of Semiramis. And it wouldn't be too shocking to find out that Disney pulled from this ancient tale and used it as inspiration to give Ariel a daughter, thus making Ariel the only Disney princess to have a child. Now, from a story point of view, that seems to make a lot of sense, but another user from Quora had different reasoning as to why they thought Disney decided to animate a daughter into Ariel's life. You see, they believed that it was all about expansion, and for a giant company like Disney, that definitely adds up, especially when you think about the fact that following the failure of The Little Mermaid 2, as it was not perceived well by fans, sort of changed up Disney's game in terms of the next few films they would release. All of the way through the 1990s and the early 2000s, Disney had this idea that expanding on projects, films, and franchises that they had already released was going to be their best way to get more popular. This is why it seemed like every Disney animated classic was getting a sequel, or sometimes two. Expand on a brand that's already working, it just seemed like good marketing. However, following the release of The Little Mermaid 2 in September of 2000, the sequel would receive countless bad reviews from high-ranking movie critics at the time. Well, it's believed that the movie failed for two reasons. One of them was that Disney fans wanted something new to watch, not another movie that they were already familiar with. But the other big reason was thought to be that audience members didn't like Melody or the idea of Ariel having a child, leading some people to believe that the only reason Disney hadn't had more films showing Disney princesses with children is simply because it didn't work when they tried it. And because expansion was the only thing on their mind, they had to really focus on what was working for them, which included starting up brand new franchises. And when that worked, there was pretty much no need for Disney to go back to their older stories, at least not until it was time to turn them into live-action reimaginings. This brings us right into the next theory, which involves the idea of what a sequel actually is, and the fact that when it comes to film, sequels seem to take on a bunch of different forms. I mean, you have to direct sequels, which tend to take place following the events of the first film in the franchise, following the same characters and whatnot. But then you have other forms of sequels that act more like middlemen, kind of like Lion King 1.5. While it was technically a sequel, the movie took place during the same time period as the first film, just giving us a bit more insight as to what was going on outside of the realm of the main character. It filled in the gap a bit, and as one Disney fan would point out, that's actually Disney's formula for a lot of their sequels. In their example, they bring up Cinderella 2 and 3, and the fact that the movies don't really show us any continuation on the Cinderella story. The sequels more so just fill in some gaps that the original movie had. And that got all of us thinking, and when it comes to Disney princesses, we're fairly certain that Ariel was the only one of them to get a direct sequel at that time. I mean, now we have Frozen and Frozen 2, but most people would separate the newer Disney animated films from the classics. That's not saying one is worse than the other, they are just from two totally different eras of Disney animation and storytelling. Out of the classics though, we really can't think of another sequel that was a direct sequel to the first film like The Little Mermaid and The Little Mermaid 2. I mean, it might not have gotten the best ratings, but it was the only Disney sequel at the time to actually continue the story and the life of one of their princesses beyond the boundaries of the first one. And I guess you could argue that Aladdin 2: The Return of Jafar was a direct sequel to Aladdin, but is Aladdin really a Disney princess movie? I mean, I know it has one of the main Disney princesses, but the story centers around Aladdin as the focal point. So I think that would be the same as saying that The Lion King 2 was about a Disney princess. But if you guys can think of another classic Disney movie that had a direct sequel, please let us know in the comments below, because we can't seem to come up with any and would love to hear from you. Last but not least, let's talk about the term happily ever after, because one Disney fan on Reddit seems to think that the phrase we all know and love might mean something entirely different from what we all originally believed. As a matter of fact, it might only be the English versions of the films that the phrase reads like that. And by that, I mean that in countries where English isn't the first language that's spoken, which is a lot of them, the films are obviously going to be translated into the preferred language, whether it be with subtitles or by dubbing over the voice acting with different voices. Either way, the words are going to be altered in some way to make it enjoyable for the audiences all around the world. And as you probably know by now, translation isn't always perfect, and more often than not, some words have slightly different meanings in other languages, and sentence structure isn't always going to be the same. So in English-speaking countries, at the end of most Disney classics on the screen, we would read the words, "and they lived happily ever after." And that was it. We were all like, yay, and then called it a day. Didn't think anything else past it. Well, in other countries like France, for instance, their happily ever after line at the end of the films reads a bit differently. In France specifically, the phrase reads as, "and they lived happily and had many children," meaning that, to most of the viewers who had seen the French versions of these movies, have been led to believe that almost all of the Disney princesses likely had children of their own. And as another Redditor would go on to point out, if you bring Disney TV shows into the conversation, then according to the hit ABC series Once Upon a Time, both Snow White and Cinderella went on to have children. This comment led people to begin bringing up The Lion King into the conversation, and how Simba and Nala had a child in Lion King 2. But again, I think that could be up for debate. As most people would agree, the majority of that film was focused on Kovu rather than Kiara. But as always, that's the beauty of fan theories. It's that they open up an entirely new world of discussions to be had about all of our favorite movies that almost all of us grew up with. At the end of the day, we can't help but wonder if Disney is ever going to answer the question as to why Ariel is the only princess to have a child in her sequel film. Or maybe they will start providing some of the newer princess films with children. I mean, let's be honest, I think we're all still holding out hope for a mini Rapunzel with her mother's sundrop powers. But for that, we're going to have to wait and see. Out of all these theories though, theory number 2 seems to be the most convincing to us. Disney was probably trying to expand their already successful franchises and ended up not making the cut. Although we have to say, the other theories fans pointed out definitely hold a lot of ground as well. What do you guys think though? Why is Ariel the only Disney princess to have had a child in her sequel films? Be sure to let us know in the comments below. For now, that's all, Disney fans. Let us know what video you'd like to see next in the comments, and like and subscribe for more magically packed videos.